Okay, so let's talk about Chris a little bit here. So Chris is not only you've seen his Instagram, you know he's an amazing photographer, but he's also an accomplished explorer. He is a creative director, speaker, author, and a filmmaker. And as I mentioned to you, I first met him 10 years ago when we did an interview on my show, Advancing Your Photography. I was introduced to him through his book, The California Surf Project. I live in Carmel. There's a little bookstore here. I saw it on the shelf. It caught my eye. Anything with the word surf in it immediately is a keyword in my mind, and I immediately jump on it. But what I loved about this book is his adventure, his writing, and there was actually a film that went along with it. So I got a hold of him. We did the interview. I interviewed him again for my book Create because he is such a creative person. I wanted to get his take on creativity. There's a chapter with him in here. You guys should check it out. And what I want to do, first of all, before I bring Chris on, I'm going to just play this short clip from my original interview that will introduce you to his style of photography and his teaching of photography. Here it is.
I've always been about like kind of moody, black and white, the moments in between. Like, I mean, I've shot in the rain, I've shot in the snow. I don't even care because sometimes that's all part of the trip. You know, you're going to get your A plus, great sunny photos, but it's kind of like about building the story. And so I always look for those moments in between, where it's someone maybe just getting ready or they don't know you're shooting or, you stop and you see something that's just like absolutely beautiful, and maybe it's more than just capturing like that moment, but you want to kind of pull back and see like, okay, this is all beautiful, but what's going to be more interesting? Is it going to be me taking in this moment, or is it going to be the people I'm with? What is their reaction, and kind of pull back and see like, what are they thinking? What are they experiencing? Maybe they're like jumping up and down, looking at the surf or something like that, or waxing up their boards or frantically doing this or that. And I think that when you stop and think about what's going to be the most significant thing, a lot of times it's not necessarily what you're seeing, but it's what someone else might be seeing. And so if you kind of take a step behind them, that's a good way to try and survey things too.
Welcome, my friend, and thanks for
Yeah,
coming back
hi-
after all these years.
thanks for having me. I'm stoked to be here.
Yeah,
That footage is old, man. It's crazy.
isn't that
I'm, def-
amazing?
I'm definitely pretty young there. That's some old stuff. That's wild.
You were already blowing my mind with those images. I mean, when a photograph for another photographer is so good that you wish you had taken it yourself, and every one of your images is like that for me.
Thanks, man. It's been a real joy to share that work, and honestly, just understanding the difference from evolving from one industry and then going into another one. That's a real eye opener for me. Being able to kind of see how the just looking back at those old images and see how the work is transitioned. That's really unique for me.
That's great. And we're going to look at some of your images here in a minute because I do want to get kind of caught up on, what's happened in the meantime. You've done so many things. You've done a TED Talk. You've you've released a major motion picture, and you've written like how many more books since then?
Um, I've written about seven. I've worked on about seven books since then. Yeah, books. I
Wow.
mean, publishing and books have been a huge part of, I think, what's made me motivated as a photographer to kind of create, I guess, a voice for myself and my work. It's also just this tangible thing that I think you can always carry that is, to be honest, I think the greatest portfolio you could create, something really special about that.
Well, that's interesting because in this book, Create, like I talk about the final stage of the creative process is you have to get your work out to the world. You
Mhm.
can't just leave it on your phone. You can't just leave it on your computer. You're never going to be satisfied. And just having it in digital form is just, that's one way of sharing your work. But putting it in print, putting it on the walls, you
Yeah.
know, is so important. I mean, having books, even if you make your own book, like with Blurb, getting it out to other people and getting it in their hands is really important. Obviously, you've really mastered that. That's great. So let's
I don't know
talk.
about in some ways. Yeah.
Well, I know it's always a process, isn't it? I mean, there's a book is like anything. It's a project. It has a lot of work involved, and there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that go into it. But it's kind of amazing when you're done, right?
And I think it's a lot more approachable for a lot more photographers and creatives than they think. And the idea that a book is this big, enormous process. I mean, it boils down to a good idea, usually a good designer, and some decent text, right? Hopefully. And really, the process of making the book in and of itself is not that challenging. I think that self-publishing nowadays is more accessible than ever. And I urge every photographer out there to make a book at some point, because I think it teaches you a lot about your work, and it teaches you a lot about maybe what you missed in those moments and what you need to still create or document. So yeah, I think it's a worthy endeavor, for sure.
Absolutely. So let me ask you a question that I asked you those many years ago, and just see what kind of answer you come up with now. So, Chris, what are the key points that you use every time you pick up a camera, or even before you pick up a camera? Those core points of photography that you rely on.
Yeah, I would absolutely say that, it depends on so many factors. I mean, there's no way to say that there's a perfect formula for what I might look for on every shoot. I think it depends on if I'm shooting a portrait assignment, or it depends on if I'm shooting an environmental assignment. I think that the key component for me is that typically, most of the time, the best work comes with having a vision for it first. And I think a big part of that is speaking to that concept of what you see in your mind's eye, and then creating that, right, and creating as many opportunities. To me, there's no such thing as luck in photography. There's no such thing as just dumb luck. There's always a level of preparation. I mean, if you walk outside and you brought a camera with you, you're in some way prepared, right? If you put a battery in that camera, you're even more prepared. So for me, the first component is preparedness. Like, if you want to capture a great image, imagine if it's sunrise and you're in New Zealand and it's beautiful, and the night before you were shooting time lapses or long exposures and you have an ISO 4000 on your camera. So I'm saying here is, in the evening before, you need to be prepared for what that morning is going to look like. Taking that moment, that time to prep yourself and your equipment so that you can literally push the trigger button. And maybe the camera is set up at ISO 100 at f11 at 2/50th of a second, so it's just ready for the morning. Preparedness is one of the big things. I would say the second thing is, be willing to evolve. Be willing to not be so sticking to your guns, that you're and your creative vision, that if something else happens, if something new occurs, you can't shift and or kind of evolve that focus of what you're doing, right? To me, that's really important, because there's a lot of moments where I've been so just, the idea is so baked in my mind that I'm not accepting of anything new. So I think being able to evolve and being able to shift, and that comes with a bit of time and energy to realize maybe that your creative process, my creative process, isn't always the perfect one. Like being open to new things that might come in, and that's really how I think great images are created. Like, if you go to the beach and you have a vision for how this shot's going to be, but really the shot is 200 feet down the beach or on a cliff, be able to move, be willing to move, and be willing to sacrifice something to do so. And I would say the third thing is always asking yourself, what's the story, right? What's the story?
Right on.
But from the moment you leave the car, or the moment you leave your house, or the moment you get on the plane, what's the story? What's the story I'm trying to tell here? And I'm not saying that every photograph needs to be this deep, complicated story, but in many ways, it's important to recognize that you have the ability to say something more meaningful than what the image can say, which really is the story behind the photograph. And I hope that people can start to consider that a lot.
That is really, all those points are really good advice. On the preparedness, Ansel Adams said, chance favors the prepared photographer. It's actually
Oh,
a quote from Louis Pasteur said, "Chance favors the prepared mind," and Ansel Adams just changed it to the prepared photographer. And he two of his most iconic images. One is Moon over Half Dome, and the other one is the moon shot in New Mexico. Were both taken absolutely at a moment's notice.
yeah, I love that story about him just jumping out of the car and setting. He had like 20 seconds. But how cool is it that his most profitable image, as well as his most well-known image, his most recognized, that was the byproduct of having done that so many
So
times
many
to where
times.
he could jump out of the car and compose a beautiful photograph and not be flustered. It's such a it's a telling thing.
It is absolutely, and on the other side of that, he would spend 9 hours waiting for the clouds to move in a certain spot. But again,
Right.
that's another way of being prepared.
Totally.
Good advice. Okay, well, listen, we're going to look at some of your images here in a second, but in terms of, you probably have already answered this, but in terms of getting an image that is really going to grab people emotionally, any particular advice for that?
Yeah, the light plays such a huge role. I lend towards wanting to shoot more silhouettes. The reason I love shooting silhouettes is because there's a sense of anonymity in the image that allows the viewer to then put themselves into that position, right? So there's a relatability to shooting a photograph that is in some way shot during those first 20 minutes of sunlight or that those last 20 minutes of sunlight. And that's the golden hour, right? But
Yeah.
even more important than the golden hour is the fact that when you're shooting a subject where you can't really see the face, you can't really see the logos, you can't really see the clothing, all of that becomes unimportant, and all you're focused on as the viewer is the action. What's happening? What am I seeing in this image? Can I relate to it? Do I relate to the movement, the motion, the light? And so I think that for me, I aim to shoot images that the viewer can really insert themselves into. And I guess to really boil it down, if you were to take the idea of shooting a silhouette and then shooting a relatable image, you're kind of putting it into this one terminology where you want to shoot a photograph that's timeless. And that's really what it's all about. And I mean that in the truest sense, that you can't date the image. If the image feels like 1967 or 2020, great. It should feel like it could happen anywhere, anytime. And I think that's really nature in its purest form. And I really aim to shoot photographs that strike that fine balance. And that to me is how you create an emotional image.
But the next thing I want to do here, let me just get this set on the screen, Chris. Um, so this, I don't know if you can see it yet, Chris, because there's a little lag, but you know which one it is. It's the girl
Yeah, yeah,
surfing
yeah.
tell us about this photo. It'll come on the screen here in a second. There it is. Tell me about this image. I am intrigued and I have some questions for you, but I'd love to hear the story first of all.
Yeah, so that's an interesting photograph. This is actually one of my favorite photographs to talk about because of the fact that, first of all, there's this beautiful kind of feminine form walking on a longboard. It's late at night. There's the sun is just about to drop. This is summertime, and the cool part about this image to me is that I'm standing in about 1 foot of water. I mean, I'm literally like just standing up
Really?
like this. Yeah, I mean, honestly, any person out there who has the use of all four limbs could shoot this photograph really easily. This required no skill, no special talent. I mean, it's kind of what I love about it is that the a lot of times we have this vision that we need to have these, like really good swimmer or we're a really talented water photographer to create an image like this. And the truth is, no, I think like understanding that with a little bit of vision and a little bit of understanding of what you want the shot to look like, you can create something beautiful. And this photograph has definitely been one of my most, I guess I'd say, prolific. The reason being A lot of things. First of all, let's just break it down. The girl is surfing left to right. We read left to right. It's
Yeah.
always going to be easier for someone to translate an image when the action is happening in that way. I'm also leaving space where they're going. These are big topics, and I'm really just touching on them with
Yeah.
the paint. But you're always wanting to leave space to where they're. To me, it's more important to show where somebody's going than where somebody's been. Why? Because if I was panning over more left, I'd be showing the trail of whitewater. Nobody cares about that. They want to see the clean, open wave, and
Yeah.
they want to see the landscape falling away. So there's the girl, there's the sun, there's the landscape, there's the wave, there's all these layers. It's not so much about rule of thirds as it is adding as much depth as possible. Now consider this. If this photograph was shot midday, what would be different? You would see her hair, you would see her skin color, you'd see her wetsuit, her logos, you would see everything, her board, but you don't see that. And because you don't see that, you are able to get lost and have a little escape with just the image itself. And the beauty of this image to me, specifically a photograph where it's not this big, massive, gnarly wave and dudes are getting barreled and there's all this bravado, is that there's this gentle, and again, I'm going to use the word feminine approach to how she's surfing. And it relates to a lot of people because most folks who've ever surfed, they can't relate to standing up on a huge wave, but they could relate to being in the ocean when the sun's setting on a 1 foot wave. You
Totally.
know, this speaks to all those people. So to me, that's what makes it so powerful. And I think that in many ways, it's one of my favorite photographs because of that fact, because of the fact that I know it can speak to just a huge audience of folks who are wanting to kind of have that escape. So
Chris, it's basically a perfect photograph. I mean, you have the wave being a leading line. You've got the color. You've got the sun right next to her leg there, which just draws your attention there. It's like saying, look here, but then look at the rest of this story. And you're right, it
yeah,
gives it layers and depth, which that's a,
I appreciate that. I mean, I really try to think about the way in which we sort of relate to images visually. And that's one thing I noticed is like when you're scanning across an image, I mean, from an editorial standpoint, there's also a benefit because it could be used as a cover or it could be used as a spread because
right.
she's not off the gutter of the page. But I think that visually we tend to want to see where the person's going. It helps us tell the rest of the story, right? If you
Yeah.
see where if I was panned really hard, it would just kind of be this like feathery whitewater on the wave. It wouldn't be that interesting, but I'm showing the sort of the beautiful path forward. That's important to me.
And the story is so evident here. It's like one frame of a movie, but you kind of, and I think you're right. Anybody who surfed just adds the rest of the movie because probably the most aesthetic time to surf is exactly when she's surfing. Either because the sun is rising or the sun is setting. It's my favorite time. You've got the glass of the water, which is almost like you'd use an ND filter, and I know you didn't because there's lots of other motion. It was that glassy though.
Yeah,
And
super glass.
anybody who surfed just immediately gets stoked because this is the most pleasurable surf experience you can ever have.
Totally.
You're going to get out of the water and you're going to have some fish tacos and hang out with your buddies, and it is that one frame of a whole story, and we just kind of add to the rest of it.
Totally. Yeah.
That's awesome. I think we have a couple of questions. We might have. Are you okay on time, Chris? Or can we take a couple of questions?
Absolutely.
I don't want to take up too much of your time. Somebody said, how did you manage to bring out the color of the surfboard so clearly when up to the leg the girl is in complete silhouette? That is a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the reality is the surfboard is glossy, right? It has a finish, so that's going to reflect light. The wetsuit is rubber, and that's going to absorb light. It is black. So I mean, that's just kind of the natural like way in which this is going to process. Ultimately, being able to to go in there and touch it up just ever so slightly with the brush is really helpful too in Lightroom. But yeah, the beauty of that image is that any surfboard surface is actually coated in a resin, right, which is super reflective. So
Right.
so yeah.
That reminds me of a question I was going to ask you. Lightroom. So, do you have any like top tips for processing in Lightroom that you kind of lean towards?
I mean, I'm not going to be able to describe which brush and this and that over this Skype
Yeah.
call. It's such an impossible task to do. I mean, for me, Lightroom is a huge process. We should probably get our faces back on this
Yeah,
YouTube
yeah.
thing anyway.
Here we go.
Yeah, ultimately, um, for Lightroom, for me, it's the only way to really describe it is that I at all costs avoid touching contrast bar, saturation bar, because my goal is always to select the areas that I want to work with and only adjust the tone curve as well as the sort of either I want to push it towards a cool place or push it towards a warm place, meaning that all I'm going to really adjust is the temperature. So for example, highlighting or selecting a certain area or going into a certain area and just adjusting it warm to cool, because if you try to slide that saturation bar or slide that contrast bar, you're asking the computer to tell you where this image needs color, and it just is going to add it, right?
Yeah.
There's no tension there. And I think that in many ways, having worked in the darkroom for years, it's the same thing as when you would, dodge and burn, or you'd put a red filter over something to make it more black. That's kind of the process. All we have in an image is we have different temperatures of cool and warm. And that really plays into an even bigger color theory, which I've really been tried to implement into my images, which is that cool and warm tones, they push and they pull, right? When you study three-dimensional color, you understand that that's what makes a sunset so significant, is the fact that we have these two highly contrasting colors that really work in opposition to create depth. And depth is the only thing I want to create. I don't care about color. I don't care about saturation. All I care about is depth. And if that requires contrast, I use it through the tone curve.
Boy, that is awesome. I'm going to have to digest that, because I'm going to watch that again. There's a lot of, you packed in a lot of information into that. You guys really pay attention to what he said, because there's so much wisdom in that last 90 seconds or whatever it was. One more question, and then I'm going to ask you a final question. So, what are the most important elements? This is from Ethan. What are the most important elements to plan when going on a photography-focused road trip, such as your California coast trip?
Yeah, yeah.
How did
That's
you
a
make
good
sure
question.
you were getting the photos you were looking for? Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. So I think besides obviously really good snacks and a good playlist,
yeah,
um, and some sort of a comfortable vehicle, when I set out I mean, I've done a lot of road trips again, and I think that the purpose of the trip in and of itself is maybe the most important thing to focus on in the beginning, because when I did the California Surf Project road trip, which was from Canada to Mexico, I had an intention. I wanted to create a book, and that book that I wanted to create was really focused around the idea of surfing in every coastal county. So if you have some structure or sort of a goal in mind, that's the first thing that really helps. If you don't, that's totally fine. But I think that having structure or a goal really can kind of bring the focus in a little bit. Now, one thing I'd say is that if you are intending to walk away from that trip, wherever you're going, with like a series of images, think about, if you were to put this in a book and you were to tell the complete story, what would that look like? Would there be portraits? Would there be landscapes? Would there be, images of more than just, portraits of who's shooting it, of who's working on it? And again, where are the words coming in? Where is the story? Is this journal entries? Are you working with a writer to tell this story? I know that I'm getting like way ahead here and I'm thinking way advanced, but really, there's nothing worse than coming back from a great road trip or a great trip in general and feeling like, oh my gosh, we're like 80% there with telling a great story or having a great article, but we never considered these things. It can be as simple as like taking a photograph of like the little mom and pop general store where you had the best berry cobbler of your life, right? Depending on the story you want to tell, those little tiny details can really add up to make a great article for Outside Magazine or something like that, right? It's not always about the peak action, the high, big moments. I think that being able to kind of look at the micro and sort of the macro is really important. So to me, when I work on a road trip, if I'm not just going from point A to point B, but I'm actually stopping along the way and I'm taking my time, I really want to digest each place I'm going. I want to look at the destinations. I want to hone in on my hero locations, but also all those places along the way that I might stop. Those are equally as important. So giving time and space, and I think that the importance of a good road trip that people kind of forget is that it takes a long time. Like I spent 50 days on the California coast, 2 to 3 days per county, right? If you're just going to drive somewhere overnight, you're probably not going to get the images you need. But if you're actually going to spend that time, then that's critical. Yeah.
Wow, fantastic. Okay, Chris, so we're going to wrap up, but is there any final advice you'd like to leave our folks with out there just to help them advance their photography to the next level?
Yeah. I mean, if there's one singular good piece of advice that I've been given, and this has really been from years of working on films and trying to put my work in front of different audiences, is whether through speaking or in front of editors, is that you should never describe people what they can already see, right? And that piece of wisdom really is so important. Like when you look at a photograph of that girl surfing, you don't need to know that it's evening time and she's surfing a wave and she's on a longboard. You don't care about that. All that stuff is irrelevant. Why? Because you can see it with your eyes. So what do you need to know? Well, you, as the photographer, as the creative director, as the storyteller, what did you feel in that moment? What did that look like to you? What was the goal? You felt the water saturating your suit. You felt the wind, raise the hair on the back of your neck. Give me a sense of what it was like to be there. Give me the feeling, the emotion. And that's a real huge part of, I think, what makes an image successful, what makes something valuable and worth sharing is the fact that you have something worth saying about it. And I don't want to bum anybody out, but if you take an experience like that and you're like, I got this great image, it's so awesome, it changed my life, I can't wait to share it, and you're sitting there and you've got Twitter fingers and you're all excited to post it online, and you go to share it and all you say is, the mountains are calling and I must go. I think that when you do that, you do yourself a huge disservice, because that's not your quote. That's not what it felt like to you. You're just taking somebody else's words and you're kind of sharing that. So I would hope that you can extract, I guess, your concept of what it was that you felt there and write that out and figure out how to use your voice as well as your camera to really share an experience.
Wow, fantastic advice. And obviously that goes into your social media communication as well, what you're going to say in your comments and
100%.
wherever else you use it. Well, Chris, thank you for giving us this amazing inside look into your world of photography and creativity. I am super stoked myself, and I'm sure everybody else is out there.
Thanks, Mark.
And you and I will catch up again soon. So
Anytime.
thanks, amigo.
Yeah,
Okay.
appreciate it. See you, buddy.
Okay, take care. So you guys, we're kind of on a journey together, and I think this is a really important thing to take our time, put it into creativity, use this time to build our creativity, because that's actually going to strengthen each one of us and strengthen ourselves as a community. So will you guys invite your friends, subscribe, share this video, go ahead, like it, leave your comments on the actual video itself. I totally we read all your comments from the live video broadcast afterwards. And I always share that with our guests because they really love seeing those. And remember to get out and capture your own images of life.